Phew. Okay. This giant pile is all the fabric I have been hoarding to make myself leggings, and since it is well into cozy season, I figured it's about time to sew this up so I can actually wear it. And I'll be taking you guys along for the journey and showing you my process on how I make leggings so that you guys can make perfect fitting leggings for yourselves too. To make leggings, you'll want a good quality material that's got a lot of stretch in both horizontal and vertical. Ideally, you want stretch in both directions. However, if you can only find a knit material with stretch in one direction, that's okay too. The amount of stretch you have on your fabric will affect your pattern draft, so you want to have a good understanding of how much stretch you have in your fabric before you begin drafting your pattern. To do this, hold the fabric between both your fingers and stretch it along a ruler. You'll want to see how much farther your measured piece will stretch. So in my case, I'm stretching from a 5-inch block all the way out to 10 inches, which means I have a 100% stretch. You want to work with a higher quality material that's nice and thick because that will prevent the material from going see-through and a little bit sheer when you bend or when it stretches around your body. If you have special effects materials that have holographic or shiny metallic-y finishes, you want to make sure that when you stretch them, they don't crinkle and rip the actual print. It has to have good recovery so that once you put your leggings on, they're not going to rip the print or stretch out awkwardly. Before we get to drafting our pattern, we're going to need a few key measurements. The first and easiest is going to be your waist measure. You'll want to grab a stretchy piece of elastic and tie it around your waist to mark off your natural waist. To get the correct ratios in your pattern, you'll want to draft this pattern with your natural waist. Measure all the way around your body where the elastic sits. You want it to be snug, but not too tight that it's digging into your body. Next, you'll need your full hip measurement, and this is taken around your body where the fullest part of your bum is. Next, we'll need to do your thigh circumference, and this measure is taken on the fullest part of your thigh. After that, you'll need your circumference around your knee and your circumference around your ankle. Now we'll need to get the front and back rise measurements. To take this measurement, you're going to need a carpenter's square like this one. With this tool, you'll want to place it between your legs and hold it comfortably against your body. You'll want the bottom portion of it to be parallel to the floor. On the vertical portion of the ruler, you'll measure from the inside corner up to where your elastic around your natural waist is. This is your front rise. You'll do the same procedure with your back rise. Now we'll just need to take a bunch of length measurements. You'll want to use your tape measure to measure on the outside of your leg from your waist all the way down to your ankle. That's your full length of your legging. Then you'll need to measure from your knee to your ankle and from your knee up to the fullest part of your thigh. And those should be all the measurements that you need. Up next, we'll need to do a bit of math to prep our measurements for the pattern draft. Since we're working with a stretchy material, we'll need to introduce a bit of negative ease to allow for a nice tight fit. Depending on how stretchy your material is and how much compression you want from your garment, you'll want to add between 5 to 20% of ease. If your fabric is super stretchy and you want a tight fit, you'll want to add anywhere between 15 to 20%. But if your fabric is firm and has low stretch, or it has stretch in only one direction, then you'll want to add 5 to 10% of ease. The easiest way to introduce this reduction is by taking the percentage of ease you want and subtracting it from 100%. This will be your reduction factor, and you will multiply all of your circumference measurements by this reduction factor to introduce the correct amount of ease. For example, if I want to introduce 20% ease and my waist measurement is 25 inches, my reduction factor is 0.8, and so I will multiply 25 by 0.8 to get 20 inches. This will be the measurement that I use in my pattern draft for my waist measure. The final bit of math that we need to do is to calculate the front and back rise depths. These measurements affect the way that the crotch curve is formed, and incorrect rise depth is often the culprit behind poor fit and camel toe issues. To calculate rise depth, we subtract half the waist circumference measure from the thigh circumference. Remember, this is done after the negative ease is applied to all your circumference measures, so the numbers that you are using for this calculation should be your reduced circumference measures. Once you have your rise depth measure figured out, you will then split this measure between your front and back portions of your pattern. 1/3 of the rise depth is allocated to the front crotch seam, and the remaining 2/3 is allocated to the back crotch seam. Now we can finally begin our pattern drafting. I'll be doing this draft on a smaller size scale so that I can fit everything into my camera frame, but you'll want to find a piece of paper that is a little bit longer than your waist to ankle measures so that you can fit everything onto the paper when you're drafting. To start, you'll want to draw a long straight line all the way down the center of your paper. This will be your center line for your draft and corresponds to the outseam of a regular pant pattern. At the bottom of this line, you'll want to mark a point for your ankle. From there, you'll measure along this line from your ankle to your knee point, mark that, and from your knee to your thigh point, and mark that. At each of these points, you'll want to mark a line perpendicular to the center line. Along these new lines, you'll want to mark the corresponding reduced circumference measurements at each landmark. So for your ankle, you'll want to mark your ankle width, your knee width, and your thigh width. Make sure that the width you're marking is centered along the center outseam. So for example, if your ankle is 14 inches, you'll want to make sure that there's 7 inches on either side of your center line. Once all of your circumference lines are in place and marked off, you'll want to connect all the edges across the 3 different landmarks with a straight line. So connect your thigh, your knee, and your ankle on each side. This will form the basic leg shape for your legging pattern. At the knee, you'll notice there's a bit of a sharp point, so you'll want to use a curved ruler to taper and smooth out that edge. For the crotch draft, I'll use a concrete example to better illustrate the steps. The vertical blue line is the continuation of our center outseam, and the horizontal line is our reduced thigh circumference. I've marked off the thigh width along that line evenly on both sides of the center line. As mentioned before, we'll need to find our rise depth, so we'll take half of our reduced waist measure and subtract it from our reduced thigh measure. Then we'll allocate 1/3 of that depth to the front rise and 2/3 of the back rise. On your thigh line, you'll want to mark your rise depth measures. On the left side mark, you'll want to measure in your front rise depth, and on the right side mark, you'll want to measure in your back rise depth. Remember, you're measuring from your thigh marks towards the center line, and the measurement should correspond to your front and back rise depths. From these new rise depth marks, you'll want to draw a perpendicular line up. On the left side, you'll want to mark off your front rise measure, and on the right side, you'll mark off your back rise measure. These are the measurements we took earlier with the carpenter square. Next, you'll want to draw a gradual curve from your front to the back, and that creates your waistline. You'll notice that since you added a curve, there is no longer a 90-degree angle between the rise line and your waistline. To fix this, you'll want to square out a perpendicular line from your two waist points that intersects back down with your thigh line. Roughly, you're aiming to land somewhere around 3/4 of an inch at the front and about 1 inch to 1.25 inches at the back, and this is the beginning of your crotch seam. Now all that's left to do is to create the crotch curve lines. To do this, you'll need a curved ruler, and you want to draw a gradual curve from your thigh line that intersects with this new perpendicular line that you drew from the waist. You're aiming to connect your curve from the thigh to about halfway through that new line you drew. The severity of the curves you draw here will affect how the leggings fit on your body. If you have a more fuller bum, then you'll want a deeper curve to accommodate that space. On the other hand, if you have a flatter bum, then you'll want a more gradual, shallow curve. The same thing applies to the front crotch curve. If you need more space, then you'll want a deeper curve. Once you're done drafting your crotch curves, go back and make sure that your waist and crotch curve corners are at 90 degrees. Now that your draft is done, all you need to do is add seam allowance. I usually use about 1/2 inch all the way around my pattern, but if this is your first time drafting, you might want to leave a little bit more seam allowance, especially at the waist and at the hem at the ankle to allow for accommodating for fit changes. You can always cut off the extra seam allowance later. Now we're finally on to the construction. To cut out your pattern, you'll want to fold your fabric in half and lay out your pattern so that the center line lies parallel to your selvage. If you're using a knit with stretch in only one direction, make sure that stretch goes along the circumference measurements. In other words, it runs perpendicular to your center line. At the cutting stage, don't forget to add 2 small notches to your back crotch seam so you can tell your back from your front. With your 2 pattern pieces cut, the first assembly step is to sew up the inseams of the leg tubes. You'll want to fold each leg piece in half, good sides facing in, and pin along the outside edge. Now before you begin sewing, you'll need to make sure that you're using the correct needle. You'll want to select a stretch or jersey ballpoint needle so that when your machine sews through the material, it doesn't actually puncture the fabric yarns, but instead pushes between them. To do the construction seams, you'll want to use a straight stretch stitch on your sewing machine. This type of stitch is designed to withstand heavy pulling and tension and is the best suited for this type of project. It is often depicted as a lightning bolt stitch on domestic sewing machines. If you look closely at the stitch, you'll see that it's formed by the machine taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, creating a chain of what looks like little lightning bolts. This type of stitch will also prevent your seam from running too much if one of the stitches does pop, so it's perfect for crotch seams. With everything set up correctly, we can now sew the inseams that we pinned earlier. Once you're done sewing, you should end up with a nice strong seam that stretches as well. The next step is to join up your 2 leg pieces. You'll want to take one of your 2 sewn leg pieces and turn it so that the right side faces out. Then you'll want to insert it into the other leg tube. Match up the 2 center seams and pin along the crotch seam. The notches you made along the back crotch seam should also match up. Sew up your crotch seam using the same stretch stitch as before. Alright, now you have an almost completed pair of leggings. At this stage, it's a good idea to try them on and make sure you're happy with the fit. Make note of the waist height and the legging length. If you want the waist to sit lower or you want to shorten the length of your leggings, measure how much you want to adjust and simply cut the fabric off. Remember to leave some seam allowance to allow for finishing as well. To hem the bottom of the leggings, I prefer to simply fold over the seam allowance and do a wide zigzag stitch over top. This allows for a simple clean finish and maximum amount of stretch so your foot can still fit through the opening. To finish the waistband, I use a similar fold-over technique, but I also introduce a wide elastic to help the leggings stay in place. I usually use a 2-inch elastic and cut it to the same length as the finished circumference of my leggings. I usually leave about a ½ inch of extra along the elastic to account for the joining seam. To sew up the waistband elastic, I use a simple straight stitch to join the two edges and then open the seam flat and zigzag the edges down. This creates a nice clean finish. To attach the elastic to the fabric, first I mark off a ½ inch seam allowance on the elastic. I use this straight edge line as a guide to place my fabric. I then pin the fabric evenly along the elastic. To sew down the elastic, I use a medium length zigzag stitch that catches just the outside edge of the elastic. This is what that stitch should look like. Next, you'll want to turn the waistband over to the inside of your leggings and flatten it out against the fabric. You'll now sew a wide zigzag stitch along the bottom edge of the elastic just as before, securing it to the fabric. Make sure that the fabric and elastic lie flat while you're stitching. If you aren't confident in maneuvering your fabric under your machine, use pins to make sure everything is in place. This is what your finished waistband stitching should look like. This waistband technique ensures that the leggings will always sit comfortably around your waist and never slide down. If the elastic wears out or gets too loose, you can easily replace it as well. And now you have a finished pair of leggings, or maybe 2, or 3, or in my case, maybe 30. Once you know how to make them, there's just so many new possibilities that open up with colors and variations and finishes that you can use, and it becomes really easy to express your own style. And that's how I make all of my colorful, fun, sparkly leggings. Hopefully this video gave you a little bit of insight on how to draft your own perfect pattern and a few insights on how to construct your leggings, and I'll see you guys in the next video.